Welcome back to Powerland South Africa. I'm Chris Bishop. Now, just before the break, we were talking about the African Free Trade Area, which I think is one of the biggest stories that we're going to be talking about here for the next few years. Hopefully, we're going to talk a bit more about it now. Now, Ghana and Zambia are countries that have previously been seen as pillars of stability and good governance, but they've had a decline in the Africa Risk-Reward Index for 2019. The index looks at the evolution of investment, the investment landscape in major African markets, and is compiled by Control Risks and Oxford Economics. I'm joined via Skype by Barnaby Fletcher, an Associate Director Analyst at Control Risks, for the index's take on South Africa's investment landscape and the doors that could be opened by the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. You're coming to us live from London. Thank you very much indeed, Barnaby. But just like Ghana, and start at the beginning, Ghana and Zambia, the crown seems to have slipped a little bit in this particular report. What's behind that?
So there are a number of reasons behind that. The Africa Risk Reward Index, in general, we put together a risk score looking at things like prospects for political instability and other political and economic risks, and reward score based on economic indicators and also factors such as demographics and structure of the economy. Now, if you take an example like Zambia, we're seeing some worrying trends within the government, an appeal to populism, certainly, and that is being reflected in some of the policies it's taking towards the mining sector. But there's also a lot of other positive developments around the continent that at the moment Zambia and Ghana and a few other countries are being left out of.
And what about some of the growing perennial problems that people are often talking about as the continent as a whole? There's still too much borrowing going on among governments also, which is also feeding inflation, which is also another problem when people look to invest here.
So you're absolutely right. From the economic perspective, especially from the debt perspective, we're seeing almost sort of a new debt crisis in Africa, and that's kind of finding its most acute expression in countries like Zambia, where there's a massive debt problem. Obviously, we have countries like Mozambique, where there has been a debt crisis. What I suppose is encouraging, without downplaying the risks that these perilous fiscal positions present, what's encouraging is that a lot of governments around the continent are reacting to that debt crisis by actually rethinking the state's role in the economy. So what we're seeing in Zambia, even in Zimbabwe and Angola and Mozambique, in multiple different countries, is that governments finding themselves strapped for cash are actually thinking, do we need these huge state-owned companies? Often they are poorly run, often they are loss-making, putting pressure on government finances, and instead they're partially or wholly privatizing a lot of companies, which of course offers opportunities for private sector investment.
How much resistance is there left? I mean, I know there's quite a bit here in South Africa to biting the bullet and privatizing some of these, especially loss-making state-owned companies, which you could say probably had their day about 20, 30 years ago.
There's a lot of resistance. And it's important to note that there is a debate to be had about the state's exact role in the economy. We're certainly not advocating that all companies be privatized. The state does have a role in certain sectors. But when we see governments try and push these reforms, and especially we've seen some quite dramatic reform agendas being proposed by, for example, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia or President João Lourenço in Angola, to a certain extent, even Cyril Ramaphosa in South Africa, they're facing resistance both from within their parties and governments, both from an ideological perspective, but also, especially in a country like Angola, from vested interests that have commercial interests and benefit from the structure of the economy as it currently stands. But there's also fiscal and economic realities. Simply put, a loss-making, poorly managed state-owned company, which of course not all of them are, but a lot of them are, is not a terribly attractive prospect to investors. So we constantly hear stories from our clients of, for example, a government looking to sell a small stake in a national aircraft carrier, for example, and private investors saying, well, No, because you're still expecting that aircraft carrier to go and pick up politicians or the national football team for free, and that's not a business model that we can invest in.
And it seems that the current generation of politicians here, they still see it also as the commanding heights of the economy, which is also a difficulty when it comes to these things. And what about South Africa here? You mentioned Cyril Ramaphosa there. This country, I think, managed to contract 3.2% in the first quarter of this year, according to your calculations. Are you seeing any sign at all that there may be any change for the better in the next year, 2 years or so?
Absolutely. South Africa is often overlooked, and actually in our risk reward index in this edition, it doesn't have the highest reward score improvement, it doesn't have the highest risk score improvement, but taken together, it's actually one of the best performing, the most improved overall risk reward score. What I think is forgotten about South Africa is that it is still one of only a handful of really sizable economies in Africa, and that presents opportunities. And out of those sizable economies, it still has the best infrastructure, the most independent judiciary, the biggest collection of expertise there. Now, it's undoubtedly going through challenges at the moment, and I know that there's a sense of disappointment among many people who expected Ramaphosa to come in and make dramatic changes overnight. But one of the key themes that we've highlighted in this edition of the Risk Reward Index is that this idea that, I suppose, the cliche of the African big man leader that can change a country on a whim is just that, the cliche. It's a myth. You know, especially if you look at South Africa, you have very complicated and sophisticated party structures, government structures, and structures of the economy, which can't be changed overnight. So I suppose the key message from our point of view on South Africa is that there are signs of optimism, there are things to be positive about, but change is going to be slow. And the Ramaphosa government is going to be one of compromise, using political capital and fiscal resources sparingly to make the important reforms because they are in limited supply.
Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for. But thank you very much. Live to us from London there was Barnaby Fletcher, an Associate Director, Analyst at Control Risks. We're going to a short break now, hopefully. When we come back, we'll be going live to Durban.